Hello, coaches. Thanks for joining us for another tactical insight with Modern Soccer Coach. Today, we're joined by Ryan Quinn. We're going to talk about David Beckham's role in the 1999 Manchester United treble winning team, different positions he took up, just by David Beckham in general as well. It's written by Ryan Quinn. Ryan's joined us. He's written an article on this here. The article is below. If you want to read it, please check it out. Also, check out Ryan's work, doing some brilliant work on the analysis side too. Before we start, please subscribe below to the channel. Don't miss any of the content we've got coming up in terms of the videos and the coaching content. So please subscribe, please like it. And of course, don't forget to check out modernsoccercoach.com for sessions, coaching books, webinars, everything coaching as you prepare for the new season. Here we go. Enjoy. Ryan, thanks so much for joining me today. Modern Soccer Coach Analysis Podcast. Excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me, and I hope you're doing well.
The topic I just said before we start recording there, it got me reading the article. And I still am a 90s football fan. I was a Manchester United fan before I started coaching, and after coaching, I'm bothered about too many teams these days, but Beckham was, I love this team. So when your article came out, I clicked on it right away. But you're a bit younger than me. You're a lot younger than me, so you didn't grow up in the 90s as a football fan. Why did you write this article?
Well, obviously, like yourself, I'm a Manchester United fan. And I started a series of retro pieces during the first wave of lockdown, just to give me something to do, something to report about whilst the football was postponed. And my dad's a big United fan as well, so he would often rave about the treble winning team that he obviously is old enough to remember fondly. And I would often go back and watch games just for fun, and I always really liked Beckham myself too. And so he was just a player that was interesting to analyze as well, because I think people get kind of caught up in the celebrity of Beckham and forget that he was actually also a really, really good player. So it was just an interesting topic to cover.
The most underrated player in the history of the game. I've said it. I've got abuse of this on social media. I think we'll get into that, and I'll tell you why I think he's the most underrated. The team, and this is from your article, and we'll have our link below for all the coaches to go and read it. So we talk a lot as coaches about getting the balance right. You know, the Arsenal, the Chelsea, some of the great Premier League sides. But this team, I always think it had just such a unique balance. Where do you think he got it right, or how would you break it down?
Well, this particular team was the team that played Bromby at Old Trafford in the Champions League group stage, and I think when you think of the word balance, it really comes from the midfield above everything else in this team for me. And I think the reason why that is because, well, I remember writing in the piece that Beckham had a very different role to the left-sided player, which was either Ryan Giggs or Jesper Blomqvist, and in this case against Bromby, Blomqvist. And I think an example of that is how where you had the right back, in this case Phil Neville, and then who was substituted for Wes Brown, would often make runs ahead of Beckham, whereas the left winger was a far more direct option and often making runs themselves. And you can also see in midfield, Roy Keane and Paul Scholes is a great partnership, one of the best midfield partnerships in the history of English and European football. But I think at this point in his career as well, Paul Scholes wasn't necessarily the kind of deep line creator that a lot of people might think him as now. He'd often make runs ahead and support the attack more often. He had 11 goals that season, which was, I think, the most of any player that wasn't a recognised striker in the United team. And Roy Keane would often obviously make runs forward himself, but he would obviously provide the balance in midfield to allow Scholes to move further forward. So it was that midfield worked in unison, but they each had their own role, which was always interesting to cover when writing this piece.
Yeah, it's interesting because even with that diagram, you push Blomqvist on there and you put Beckham inside, and you've almost got a lopsided, 4-3-3, which would be seen as routine today, but back then it wasn't.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think, although obviously it wouldn't not just been Ferguson like taking the training sessions, it might be Steve McLaren or other coaches in the at the club at the time. But I do think that in some cases Ferguson gets underrated as a tactician, as somebody who, because in that team as well, it was very adaptable. It was quite pragmatic in that in certain games, obviously you see here it's 4-4-2. You might perceive it as a lopsided 4-3-3, depending on what the left wing is doing. But a lot of the time they might have went for an extra midfielder in the shape of a 4-5-1 against a team that might have had a bit more bit more technicality to them, especially in midfield. They did that in Europe. I remember Ronnie Johnson played in midfield at one point, and yeah, it's they adapted to the opposition quite well, this United team.
Speaking of underrated, and I do agree with you, I do think Ferguson definitely, like, it's well known that he didn't do a lot of the training, but I think, obviously his management of play and his recruitment was really good. I think his systems were when we'll talk about certain things that I've even recognised myself. But Jesper Blomqvist, in your article, you said that he played 38 games and started 29. And you actually said, he's like, a lot of people, if you had have asked me before reading that how many times, and I watched this team every week, and I had the treble video and watched it until it, I would have said Blomqvist played 5 games, 10 games. That's an insane amount of numbers.
Yeah, because it's often almost mythologized that there was a consistent starting 11 throughout that whole campaign, and that midfield being Beckham, Keane, Scholes, and Giggs. But it wasn't like that at all. The 11 was often chopped and changed depending on injuries or depending on who may have been more suited, or a formation change, for example. But Giggs was, at least in your head, he seemed the first choice left winger, but Blomqvist played a lot more than you might think. I think the mythologized 11, if you want to call it that, that everyone seems to think is the go-to 11 in this treble-winning team, I think only played together once. I think it was a Premier League game. I admittedly can't remember against which team, but they only played together once. So that would be Schmeichel, Neville, Stam, Johnson, Irwin, the midfield I just mentioned, and then York and Cole up front. That team only played together once.
Wow.
So, admittedly, I think it might have been Coventry. I can't remember, honestly. I think it might have been Coventry, but I might be wrong.
That's amazing. So let's get into Beckham, and this is maybe what time does as a traditional fan of the game, and you look back and you think of that team and you realise they only played together once. I could recite the commentary on that treble video that I watched. I'm showing my age here. But I would have thought that Beckham played as wide as possible, as high as possible, all the time. And then when I thought of it, I actually went for a run this week, and I was thinking, I'm like, but Gary, if he did that all the time, why would teams not stop him? So he wasn't as one-dimensional as we think, and you allude that in your article.
Yeah, obviously he formed a really good partnership with Gary Neville in particular, who was the first choice right back, and whereas Gary Neville would provide the width a lot of the time, Beckham would drift inside. He'd support the build-up in midfield, notably with Roy Keane. And when switching the ball inside, he could receive the ball either from Keane or from a defender, and then ping it to the left winger, making the run on the opposite flank. But that doesn't mean to say that Beckham didn't make runs down the flank himself. I mean, he did. He was. There were layers to his game. It wasn't just straight. It wasn't as straightforward as you said people might think. I remember I wrote about it. We might get to it more detail later. I'm not too sure. But against Inter Milan in the Champions League quarter-final, Beckham in the first leg was up against Winter, who was a makeshift wing-back, and I think he was 33. And Beckham really exploited that kind of issue that Inter had down that side and provided 2 almost identical assists in that game. And yeah, so that showed that Beckham, although he typically tucked inside and supported the midfield that way and gave the fullback the space to make runs, he also could make runs down the flank himself.
Yeah, Barcelona, I remember that one.
but he done the same. I believe he done the same to him. I think it was Giggs' header at the back post, and
Hmm.
I think it was Scholes had an overhead kick. Was that against Barcelona as well, where Beckham's again come inside, come outside, where he's dropped the shoulder. I would have thought that if he was doing that, he would have more success in the wings against English opposition. But why do you think they were so successful? You mentioned about a 4-5-1. Why do you think they were so successful against European opposition? Because I mean, it was a real problem at the time for the top English teams to go and play top Italian, top Spanish teams.
I think it might have just been as I think come the end of the decade, English teams were evolving more tactically. I also think that it was. I just think with this particular United team, they were very good at either adapting to or really notifying weaknesses in opposition teams. And uh, I think what was interesting was for the second leg. I wrote this as well for the second leg against Inter Milan. Winter was replaced by Mikel Silvestre, who who was quicker and dealt with Beckham better down that right side, down United's right side, and that may have arguably been a reason he was signed by Ferguson later on. Um, but I also think it was because just how English sides were evolving coming into the decade. I think it was beginning of a shift, so to speak.
A lot of fans would see this picture here, and again, this is in your article against Spurs. I guess was the
Mm,
day that they won the league. Blank twice. Yeah, that's pretty normal for a right sided midfielder to be in that spot. But that wasn't normal at the time. Usually, wingers, old fashioned wingers, were to provide width at all times. But for Beckham, not only to get in this position, but also he scores from here, so he delivers in this position. I mean, you start to see why he was worth so valuable, where he could play in those, what they call now, inside channels, but he could also play with
mm.
width as well.
I like this goal as well because it starts. Giggs comes inside, passes to Scholes, and Scholes picks obviously Beckham, who's in space, and the space in the box for Beckham to pick out the shot and inevitably score. But watching Beckham in these sorts of positions, either further forward or deeper on the pitch, it makes me think that in the modern game he wouldn't play as a right side. He wouldn't play as a right winger. Um, I've often thought about this before, but I keep comparing him to Trent Alexander-Arnold, and in a way Kevin De Bruyne, but mostly Trent Alexander-Arnold. And I think the reason that is because, like Beckham, Trent Alexander-Arnold was a great delivery. He's the creative hub of that of the current Liverpool team, as is Andrew Robertson on the left side. But he get Trent, Trent Alexander-Arnold doesn't necessarily just stay on the flank. He tucks inside, and it might be, say, for example, Jordan Henderson making a run from on that right side. So they interchange positions. And if, say, for sake of argument, you put Beckham in that Liverpool team, he wouldn't play instead of Salah on the right wing.
Mm.
He doesn't. Beckham didn't provide the goal threat that Salah does. Um, and obviously, it's not so much the position nowadays. I think it's more the role that player has. So if Beckham was to be in this current Liverpool team, I think he'd slot in where Alexander Arnold does, or maybe in midfield himself in that midfield three. So it kind of goes to show that Beckham was kind of he was. I mean, he was never. I would never call him an out and out winger. He was more a wide midfielder for me. But it goes to show that in the modern game, he wouldn't play as a winger. He wouldn't play as he wouldn't play as a wide midfielder either. I don't think. And the reason I compare him to De Bruyne as well is because De Bruyne has obviously covered a lot of different roles for Man City. He's
Mm.
played as a false nine. He's he's I think in his first season under Pellegrini, he did play a bit wider. But under De Bruyne, under Pep Guardiola, he's played in lots of different positions left in on the left of a midfield three, on the right, and he obviously picks up and delivers balls in these channels. And it's interesting to compare both him and Alexander Arnold to Beckham in that way.
Yeah, I mean his technique is and similar to Trent Alexander Arnold. There's a clip I was just pulling it up when you were talking there about. I watched the game last week. Came up on my YouTube. Northern Ireland versus England, 2005. I'm from Northern Ireland.
Oh, Trafford.
No, that was when England battered Northern Ireland at Belfast. Northern Ireland won 1-0. David Healy.
Oh,
So it's got the whole BBC breakdown, and it's got the whole. So I've obviously clicked on it to watch it.
yeah.
Had a couple of hours. Kids were in bed. Two things. One, there's an argument at the start between, not an argument, but Ian Dowie's in the studio with Alan Hansen, and Beckham is playing in the sixth role, defensive midfielder, and Hansen's basically saying you can't play there. You can't play there without a defensive brain. Whereas Dowie challenges it with, well, it works for Pirlo today. You know, you wouldn't say that about Pirlo, but I'm gonna see if I can share this. Watch the second minute of the game. He gets the ball from a throw-in. It plays it and bounces it to him and gets it back, and he plays it across his body and switches the ball to Sean Wright-Phillips. Now, this is the genius of Beckham. I've never seen this pass. No one's ever. It's never been on social media. It's never been clipped. We'll talk now more specifically about Beckham. And so when I was getting ready for this here, I'll watch it in '99 myself and see if I see anything different with my coach's eye these days. So I watched all Beckham's clips against Chelsea in this season, and came into this pocket from a right. Basically, and this is what I've thought about, is back fours stayed as back fours those days. It was very much 4-4-2. From my memory of the Premier League at this era was 4-4-2 or 4-4-1-1, where it was a Zola or a Cantona or a Bergkamp that was just dropping off. But you always had a back four. And Beckham's ability to manipulate that left back, and we've seen it in the clips there of coming to the inside channel and giving Neville or Brown the space on the outside. But also, like, I thought this was brilliant where he's come in, he's dropped almost diagonally behind Keane and Scholes, and it's found himself in, that's him there on the ball. It's not a great picture, but that's him there on the ball. And you can just really see how much space he has. And people weren't aware, like, systems weren't really used to that 20 years ago.
No, I think there's two things. One, when watching games back, it was always very apparent just how much time players had on the ball at that point in time. I do think in today's game, that in that situation, there'd be someone going to press Beckham quite quickly. Beckham would still possibly know which pass he'd want to make, obviously, but I do think he might not have the time to pick it out in today's game. But also, you asked me about feedback on the piece, and one piece of feedback I did get was somebody saying how they do think Beckham could easily play as a deeper midfielder, and I do agree. I do think that he does have the passing range, but also I do think he has the work rate as well. He did have the work rate as well. You were saying what Ian Dowie had to say about Beckham playing deeper, and I don't necessarily think that he would need a defensive screen, because I mean, Ian Dowie alluded to Andrea Pirlo, but also I think Beckham had good defensive nous anyway. Even when playing slightly wider to the right, he would trap back and support the fullback against the opposition winger, and I think he had some defensive nous about him.
Just looking at this picture, like the distance between front and back for both teams it's amazing, isn't it? It's like 40 yards.
Yeah. It's quite funny to actually see that.
Yeah, I mean but that's the thing. But then you look back at it and say, all right, well, I mean, a player today might look at it, and I'm sure a young player would say, well, look how much space. But then, which brings us on nicely, his skill set had all right, so we're used today to the Rondo generation because the game is played from front to back lines and from east to west. It's very tight as well, so people can break pressure with combinations. Well, you open the game up, and now you need a different club in the bag. Now you need a 3-wood rather than a 9-iron to solve problems. And Beckham had the ability too. As you can see with this, that's why it's been played in slow motion. He's played in the centre forward with a pass that was just, Beckham-esque. But
Yeah,
so it's one thing to have the situation, but he could fit this generation of player, work rate, technique, but he did stand out in that generation for his ability to go
definitely.
30, 40
Yeah.
yards. Mm.
And I do think it kind of points out that in later decades, Paul Scholes would be making that type of pass, but he's not yet at that stage in his career where he would be doing that. That makes sense. That's what pointed out. That's what stood out to me as well when watching these games back. So yeah, I just felt that was interesting to know, because when people think of Scholes, they think of Scholes straight away as the deep lying player he eventually did become. But at that point in his career, he did play a lot more further forward.
Mm. Well, they both had the same technical skill set. I would say pretty similar. Where I've seen this, I see it decreasing in players today, young players today, because they're coming from training that is, again, small-sided stuff. They can make those quick decisions, but the ability to open up a game is why I think Beckham was, well, bring it on to our next slide here. Again, same game. I thought he had 3 in the final third. He had the ability. You mentioned the pass before. You mentioned the switch to Blomqvist on the far side, or Giggs, which very few players see today. He had the bend then, because you could, if he put, I think that's Solskjaer coming in. If he bent that into Solskjaer and scored that, then you wouldn't be surprised at all. But he also had this cut pass into that space where, and that's actually the pass he chose in this one, is a ball into the midfield, the furthest left ball, which it would be, if I was a winger, it would be a mistake to get the ball there. But he's like cut across it and found a midfielder. Amazing.
It's risky, but obviously with Beckham, he had the technique to pull it off. And you said that like there's a decrease in kind of those sorts of long range passes. Can you kind of relate that to like shots from distance as well? I kind of feel like, obviously there's goals from distance in today's game as well, but I feel like there's less of that. That's just a hunch. That's not something I have numbers with to prove. But I kind of can't help but feel like there's less shots from distance in today's game.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think some of it's down to, these areas now are usually occupied. That picture especially would talk about the spaces from back to front. Now they're occupied with 1, maybe 2 sixes holding midfielders. So now you're not getting your time to hit shots. And as well, I think, is that people are getting a bit more information today on shot location and XG and they're opting off that there. Whereas some of Beckham, I mean, the Tottenham one, this one here, he sticks in the top corner. So his ability to opt for a bend or opt for striking a ball, I mean, he was pretty multi-dimensional with his finishing as well.
Yeah, I think his free kicks had range as well. Like he could, let's say he's in that position that he's in that shot, in that steal against Tottenham. He could obviously go top right or top left. He might play it, and there was a range to his free kicks as well. And obviously scoring free kicks from various angles as well. He did score a free kick, in fact, against Bromby in the game that we noted on before. So yeah, he had a range to his free kicks.
A free kick. I remember he hit one against Real Madrid, and he's I think he came off the bench, and because he come across it. It should be a left footer hitting it, but he's come across it on his right, and it's Ron Atkinson was doing the commentary, and he was saying that's the best one I've ever seen him hit. You rarely see him hit. Where Roberto Carlos, whether he was 20 yards or 50 yards, he was hitting it the same way. Whereas Beckham had, again, more clubs in the bag. They opt for, different types. One thing I wanted to ask you about Beckham was, coming off this season, I know it finished on a bit of a down note. In his last season at United, he was kind of out of favour and stuff like that. But obviously, in world football terms, he moved on to the biggest club in the world at the time. They were buying the Galacticos, were buying the top players. What do you think it was about him that got him that move?
I mean, frankly, firstly, he was a great player. There's no doubting that. And I think obviously that maybe it was an opportunity for Beckham to get somebody like Beckham, considering the situation he was in at the club at the time. I do remember, obviously, there was the whole situation with the Ferguson's boot. And I also remember that season, so the season United won the title, Solskjaer played a lot on the right side. But also, I think it maybe the status that Beckham had, just the fact that he was a global name at that point. And also what Madrid were trying to build kind of was something that maybe they felt Beckham would suit perfectly. And also I feel it's interesting that you mentioned Roberto Carlos. So by the time Beckham went to Madrid, they had obviously Beckham, Figo, and Roberto Carlos, who were all recognised free kick takers. And it was interesting to compare them just from time to time, because I always felt that of the three of them, Beckham was probably the most consistent from free kicks. Yet I remember Roberto Carlos taking a lot of them and maybe not being as consistent. So that's just something.
Yeah, I've heard that before, that Roberto Carlos's stats on actually scoring goals and attempts is pretty low. I saw Beckham in 1997 against Tottenham. It was his kind of breakout season live, where he played on the right side. United beat Spurs 2-1 that day. He scored the winning goal from distance, and he's cut it with the outside of his right foot. You rarely, like, it's one of his best goals. You rarely see it, maybe because it was because in the early years the Premier League, and then I saw him play in the LA Galaxy. When I was over here in America, I saw him play in, I think it was 2009 or 2010. So, like, there was watching two different players, but at the same time, he had that ability, and maybe that was the change in him, where he had that ability to adapt his game, and he was a bit more, his work rate always stood out, but he was way less mobile in 2009 than he was in 1997 for the obvious reasons. Do you remember watching him at all?
I remember watching Beckham play for England, the 2006 World Cup, and in a friendly against Brazil in 2007. And I also remember watching Beckham play for Milan when he went on loan, and also for PSG, I think against Barcelona, where he did play deeper in midfield. Obviously, he wasn't as mobile come the end of his career as he would have been in his prime at United. But he had the range of passes that especially as time went on in the modern game, you'd really want from a deep line midfielder. And yeah, I do remember seeing Beckham in the twilight of his career, especially. And he was always very, very very good technically. He didn't lose that.
And this is why I say it was the most underrated, is because I think for someone to get to that level and play for PSG, AC Milan, Real Madrid, Manchester United, how many caps for England? But he didn't have pace, like out and out, that extra yard, separation speed, they call it in America. He didn't have separation speed. He couldn't beat players with speed. He didn't have a left foot. He wasn't particularly aggressive defensively, all these things that he had a right foot that was unbelievable, and he could run all day in terms of fitness and stamina. And I would put those things down to both being controllable, to where there's the great stuff you hear about him with the Bobby Charlton Soccer School, and he was a young kid. And obviously the man had talent. What I'm saying is that he absolutely knuckled down on that talent and committed on that talent, and I think that's something that I don't think, again today, I don't think we praise that enough. Maybe it's because and he has made billions, hasn't he? Like, so he hasn't done too bad out of it, but sometimes I think that's overshadowed the football, because he was exceptional.
Because I think I read before how Ferguson noted on just how much he worked on the training ground, and also it's interesting because he had a lack of pace, and most wingers do have pace, and I think he was a stark contrast from the previous right winger in the United team, Kanchelskis, who was all about pace and all about being a threat on the counter attack. Because I think that United team in particular, that the team that just before Beckham's time, was really good on the break, really good counter-attacking team. And not that Beckham wasn't necessarily like the slowest person to play on the pitch, but he wasn't rapid. And I think if I read correctly, Beckham was a centre midfielder at youth level. Very, very possible he was a centre midfielder at youth level, then converted to play on the right by Ferguson. But I think even though he wasn't necessarily rapid like Kanchelskis, he could be a threat on the counter in a different way because he could just pick out a pass so quickly and just set up and attack that way.
Yeah, that 99 season, I'm sure it's Coventry City away. Schmeichel catches counter-attack, and you wouldn't think he's a counter-attacking player, and it's York that scores it. But it's he's come up and then he's just taken one touch, smash across the 6-yard box. York scores. I think they won maybe 1-0 or 2-0 that day. You know, like that's my recollection of the video. I'd say the other thing I really liked about Beckham when we finish up here is the fact that when it went south in all his clubs, because it always goes that direction. You see footballers today, especially, where if they're not getting the playing time and they leak something to the agent and the agent stirs it and they move on or they stay. And we see it today with Pogba and they stay and it kind of goes to a place where it's a standoff until they leave. But one thing I really liked about Beckham was from a United fan, when he went back, he always respected, he always talked highly about Sir Alex Ferguson. But also when he went to Madrid, Capello said he'd never play. And he said, oh, all right, then that's fine. You know, he just accepted it. And then he needed him about 2 months later. And again, the cynic in you would go, tough, I'm happy in the reserves or something like that. And he helped win Capello La Liga with Real Madrid. And it didn't seem to fly. His ability to deal with adversity and take the high road as a young 25, 30, 35-year-old, to me, that's really, really impressive.
Yeah, I do remember that was the 2006-07 season. I think it was obviously slightly just before Capello became England head coach. Yeah. And I do remember that season because that was the season that I think it was a 3-3 draw with Barcelona, and I think Messi, I think he got a hat-trick in that game. And obviously in that season, Van Nistelrooy transferred from United to Real and was their top goal scorer as they clinched La Liga. I think they clinched it for the first time since I think it might have been 2003, and then they won it again when Beckham went to LA Galaxy, and then Barcelona had their treble, and the rest is history.
One of my favorites. I have such a soft spot for him, so I really enjoyed the piece, and it's like just these conversations we could. I'm kicking myself because I should have got more video for more stills to go through, but we'd be here all night. You'd never get the bit. Last question for you. Tell me about the website, the Conventional Playmaker. Tell me about what you do there and where you're looking to take it.
Well, it's my personal football website. It's mostly tactical analysis and call them think pieces on trending or retro topics on the game. I mostly use it as a way to get my work out there so it can lead to opportunities like this to just expand my portfolio and just see where it takes me as an occupation, perhaps full time. We'll have to see what's what in the future. It's somewhere where I can host my work and write about the game I love.
Brilliant. Ryan, top class. Keep up the great work and do me the next retro. Make sure I don't miss it. Put it in my message me on Twitter. Put it in my mailbox, and we'll jump on again. I could talk retro football all day. I love retro football. So next article you write, let me know, and I'll do a bit more homework on the slides, and we'll come back on and we'll do it again.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the praise. Thank you.
Great stuff. Cheers, Ryan. Thanks so much.
Thanks.